Another nice thing that I want to bring up is something that, well, it's kind of unusual, so I guess I better go back a bit. Our union has always had friends. Beside of ourselves and our members and so forth, we've had people who weren't even members sometimes who were very good friends to our organization. For example, Joe Sperling was the president of the Social Service Employees Union back in 1978 when the whole issue of would somebody please help the analysts try to get unionized came up. And it was Joe who went to the trouble of doing that. I became involved at his assignment at that point in time, and I've been involved ever since, so you'd have to say that Joe had an impact upon us all. Joe retired eventually, of course, from the city because he was older than I was and had been involved in the Korean War and stuff like that. So when Joe dropped out of having to work full-time for the city, he turned around and decided he wouldn't mind helping us out. He actually joined us up in time to come along and help us in the very first contested election we had after we had picked up the staff and associates, and we're now into the health and hospitals, and we were seeking to represent the supervising systems analysts. Joe jumped in and was extremely helpful. He was a volunteer all the way through, and of course we won that election 3-1. It was helpful in a lot of other elections over the years as well. Now he's gotten a little bit older by now, you can expect, because it's that many more years later, so he only comes in 1 day a week, and of course he hasn't been coming in. I wouldn't let him come in now during the COVID period, but he's still out there helping us. But he wasn't the only one. We also got a lot of help, and I've said this before, from Jim Paul, who was not even an analyst. He was the manager in charge of the Management Benefits Fund. And he opened up to give me all the information I needed to help me learn how to get started. I mean, yeah, we're all analysts, and theoretically we could do anything, but in fact, if somebody shows us how to do it first or helps us out along the way, that's an enormous help, and he was an enormous help. But beyond Jim Paul, we also had a guy named Michael Collins, and a lot of you have met Michael Collins and know Michael Collins. And Michael Collins was a bus driver who eventually became a supervisor in the Transit Authority. And he actually formed a union of the supervisors, and it grew from 300 up to, I think it was 1,100 when he finally stepped away from it. And Michael retired from the Transit Authority, but in the meantime, because he had formed a union that was trying to get people who were called managerial away from being called managerial when they weren't being treated right, he had picked up an affection for OSA, which of course was doing and continued to do the same thing. So he actually came by and said he would like to assist us, and I was delighted. And sure enough, within a year after that, we had picked up our first staff and associate staff analyst in the New York City Transit Authority. At least one of our current officers, Wilfred Sansorin, is a member of OSA because of the help we got from Michael Collins. And now, of course, Michael Collins is not with us because he did pass away. But we got a lot of help from Michael, and he did it just because he believed in us, and that was nice. The last one I want to mention before I get to the current person is Lou Albano. Lou Albano was the president of the Architects and Engineers of DC 37, Local 375, and a wonderful person all the way along. He was known to me very well because not only had they tried to help the analysts in the first place way back in time, but on top of that, he was a major figure in the Municipal Labor Committee's Civil Service Committee. OSA is a very strong civil service union, and when we got there, we found we already had Lou Albano there fighting the good fight for us before we ever arrived. And he kept on fighting that fight for all the days of his life. And he worked with us for almost as many years as he was president of 375. After he retired, he came and worked for us, and he worked that long because he believed in what he was doing with us. So we benefited from these type of people many times in the past. And now I want to tell you we have another one. So we're really getting very lucky in that respect. I mean, 2020 is a bad year, but when something good happens, something good happens. I got to know for the first time a young organizer named Michael Goodwin more than 30 years ago. Michael was an organizer for the Office of Professional Employees International Union. And the one thing about Michael that stood out to me was, my God, the man looks like my twin. He and I look very similar. If you've met him already, you know that to be the case. I spent the next 30 years having people say hello to me as if my name was Michael. Hello, Michael, they'd say to me. And they'd be sure I was Michael Goodwin. On the other hand, he had the same situation where city employees, and he didn't represent any city employees, but city employees would stop him in the street and say, Bob, what's going on with the contract? And he, of course, just explained, well, that's the other guy, that ain't me. He also was very helpful to us more than once in between times. Now, he rose in the ranks. He didn't stay an organizer. He was eventually chosen to become the president of Local 154 in New York City. They represent over 6,000 people in New York City, and he was in charge of them. They represent, for example, the job I once had. Once upon a time, a long time ago, I was a teacher in a parochial school. Well, they represent the teachers, among other professional employees, in the Archdiocese of the City of New York. And he simply keeps crossing my path in one direction or another. He also then kept on rising in the ranks, and he was eventually chosen to be the national leader for the Office of Professional Employees International Union. Now, he was chosen to be the leader of that international at a time when internationals were shrinking and shrinking, because we all know that the labor movement had so many of its jobs shipped overseas that a lot of our internationals simply were shipped away. Their membership jobs were just shipped away to foreign climes and places where there were either no unions allowed or no unions yet formed. Not Michael. Michael, as fast as he would lose people from one area, would replace them by organizing others from another place. So it turns out that when he started as the international president, they had a little bit less than 100,000, and then when he ended, they had significantly more than 100,000. So he did a really good job. But finally, he decided it was time for him to retire, and he just couldn't keep on crisscrossing the country and taking care of every problem that popped up. So he retired, and then he got involved again with us because I was recruiting people for our training classes for our delegate training. And I wanted to have people who had spent a life in labor to come and talk to the young activists who were learning how to become strong activists. Michael came twice. I mean, we had Richie Steyer from the editor of The Chief come, and he was great. I was very proud to have my friend Stanley Hill come before he passed away. Michael Collins, when he came, Michael Goodwin, when he came twice, and is more than willing to come back a third time. He really kind of likes the organization of staff analysts. More than a year ago, he approached me, and he has enormous knowledge because of the roles he's held and the jobs he's had to do. He said, "Bob, you want me to take a look at your welfare fund to see if you can save any money on your life insurance?" Well, yeah, I do, as a matter of fact, because I always worry that I'm not getting the best possible price here or the most efficient or the best service or something like that. If you were running the welfare fund, you'd have the same concerns, and if somebody else who knew what they were doing offered to help, you would want their help. So I definitely wanted his help. And I asked Yolanda Melendez and all the other people who work in that field over there, Diane and Anna and all the others, to share with him all of our numbers and all of the rules and all the regulations and who we had gone to and who we had sought and everything else. And he came back after 2.5 months of looking through the stuff and making phone calls and checking around, and he apologized. I mean, he'd just done a lot of work for us of a very valuable sort for no return whatsoever financially, and he apologized. He apologized because he said, I thought there'd be real savings there, but truthfully, you've got them down to the point where as much as you're paying in premium, you're getting back in life insurance, so actually you can't improve upon that. Well, it made me feel good, I have to admit. I mean, I was glad to hear that we were doing it right, but I'm also very grateful he was willing to do it. However, I thought that was a one-off, although it turns out it's not, because Michael has background in areas that I don't have and I don't pay attention to, and others, trustees in our union, don't have. I mean, most of us live in New York City, and we have public transportation, and while we may own a car, it's not that vital to us the way it is for people who live in the distant suburbs or if they're retired and living in Florida or Texas or places like that. Michael apparently came up with an idea for road service, something that I would never have particularly worried about one way or the other, but he did, and it mattered to his international union. So he's looking into the question of providing us with really low-cost road service so we can replace the somewhat expensive road service that we might now be paying for with a much lower one through the union. Wow, that's a nice service. And then he went further because he ran across the fact that Michael Shady, one of our volunteer activists, was working on investigating how do you get that, like, Lifeline or Life Station or one of those type things. Those are the things where you don't need them if you're young and healthy or surrounded by your family. But when you get to the point where you're the last person in the house, it becomes really important that you have some way of connecting up with some outside help in case you trip down a flight of stairs or just fall. And the only problem I mean, it's a good idea. The only problem with it is, of course, well, how much does it cost? And the truth of the matter is, some of them cost quite a bit. I mean, they do a lot of advertising on television, and you've all seen them on television, but you don't really want to pay $1,000 a year for this service if you can avoid it or get it for less. It turns out that Michael Shady had been investigating this, and Michael Goodwin was willing to help him. And so within the next few months, I suspect we'll be coming back to you with another offer from our welfare fund brought to us because of the fact that we have such wonderful people who volunteer to help us and make our union just that much better. 2020 has been a truly terrible year with mostly just bad stuff happening. But there have been a few good things along the way, and I'm glad I was able to at least mention some of those. I think at this point I have to adjourn the meeting because we don't have anything else which came in as questions. But let me just finish with, I miss you guys. I hope to see you soon.